Wanted to talk to you about using Peltex, Sew-In Peltex, and even foam interfacing without actually sewing it in place, hence the sew-in interfacing. So this is the technique that I personally use for bags like the airplane bag when I want to use Sew-In Peltex so that I don't see the crinkly Peltex in my finished bag. I want to keep it out of the seam allowance, but I still want to attach it to my fabric in some way. So I'm going to have Danny switch to the overhead camera. And I've got my piece of fabric over here. I'm going to zoom back out again. There we go. Okay, so this is my fabric that I'm going to be attaching the interfacing to. I've got it, since it's a solid, it looks the same on both sides, but I've got it face down. And here's my piece of Peltex, which I want to attach to the fabric. If you've made the airplane bag before, you know that the Peltex is cut 1/2 inch smaller. I often like to cut the Peltex 1/2 inch smaller, or whatever the seam allowance is, to keep it out of the seams so that I don't have bulky looking seams in the finished bag, and then also I don't have to be sewing over the Peltex. So I've cut the Peltex 1/2 inch smaller on all sides. If your seam allowance is a little bit different, you can adjust it to the seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and center that on the wrong side of my fabric. And then I've cut a piece of Shape Flex interfacing, and the Shape Flex is cut the same size as the fabric. The bumpy side with the adhesive I'm going to place face down, and then that Peltex is going to be sandwiched in between. So I'm going to take my iron, I'm going to set it at the cotton setting, and I'm going to first start off ironing the center of the Peltex just to get it nice and flat, just because off the bolt I had a little bit of a rolling from the Peltex over there. And then I'm going to pay attention to the margins where the Shape Flex connects with the fabric. So I'm just going to go ahead and run my iron on all 4 sides just to seal that Peltex in. And then in this way, you can use a sew-in interfacing like Peltex and still have it attached to the fabric. So using the Shape Flex to fuse it in place. Okay, so as you can see, it's fully sealed in and ready to work into my project. I've had questions in the past if you can use the same method for foam interfacing. And I just wanted to clarify before I show this demonstration with the foam that most of my projects, I do recommend keeping the foam the same size as the fabric. I do have 1 or 2 patterns, however, where the foam needs to be cut smaller minus the seam allowance. The first one that comes to mind is the Park Sling backpack. So you could very easily use the same method with the Park Sling backpack for those pieces that don't need to be full size, the same as the fabric. So again, I've cut my foam interfacing 1/2 inch smaller, which minus the seam allowance. And then the Pellon Shape Flex, the same size as the fabric. I did want to note one thing about using the foam interfacing. Since it's a little bit bulkier or thicker than the Peltex, you'll notice what happens in a second, but the Shape Flex can't quite meet the edges of the fabric so that it remains the same size, which you'll see in a minute. However, I didn't notice that this would be a problem because it's a minimal, less than a 1/4 inch difference. As you can see, the Shape Flex kind of had to shrink in a little bit to get over the extra thickness of the foam interfacing, but I didn't feel like it was a problem at all. And again, I wasn't sure if it would quite work with the foam interfacing, but it in fact does. So in case you ever need to cut your foam interfacing smaller than your fabric, and again, I recommend, unless otherwise noted in the pattern instructions, I recommend just keeping your foam the same size as the fabric, but I thought it would be fun to show this demonstration as well as the Peltex. So as you can see, it works with both foam and Peltex, and this is a great way to keep stiff interfacings out of your seam allowance. Hopefully that was helpful. All right, so